Hey guys, so this is the third and hopefully, well, it won't be, but hopefully third and final one of the UK political history video lectures. So I left off talking about how how Ireland was initially kind of left to its own devices for a long period of time, and then you had an influx of Norman feudal lords who start moving over in the 1100s, the 12th century, and they kind of did their own thing. They intermarried in with the Irish clan structure, and then eventually what happens is, because the Tudors become Protestant and the Irish are Catholic, the Irish lords who have married into the Irish sort of clan structure, and they've been there for centuries now, they become unreliable allies for Henry VIII. Henry VIII is dealing with a lot of unreliable allies in general. He's deeply concerned that, like, Spain's going to attack him because he divorced Catherine of Aragon, and he really can't take the Irish doing anything terrible to him as well. So Henry VIII decides to act preemptively. He invades into Ireland, and he establishes himself as the idea of the King of Ireland. He adds that to his list of titles. So you're not just King of England, you're King of England and Ireland. So at this point, the King of England can claim a dual crown, and then when we add Scotland, it'll be 3 crowns to it. Now, in order to pacify Ireland, what Henry does is he encourages, and in fact, in some cases, forces a number of English and Scottish Protestants to settle in Ireland. This is an act of colonialization. He is trying to lessen the potential of some areas of Ireland to rebel against him. There are certain areas in particular where there's very, very little English connection, where there, in fact, aren't any English landholders at all. So Henry targets those areas, and he really sends as many English and Scottish Protestants as he possibly can into those areas to try and pacify them, to try and make them more loyal to him. Unfortunately for everyone in Ireland, this leads to an increasing tension between Irish Catholics and the English Protestant population. And this is going to only get worse over the next 3 centuries. It's going to even result in some outbreaks of terrorism, and it's really nasty. So here we go. What happens is, you have the English who essentially become landlords in some areas, and tend to disenfranchise and take the territory away from traditional Irish Catholic landowners as well as peasants. And this means that there's kind of a dual class system going on. If you are of English extraction, if you are Protestant, you get preferential government treatment. This ultimately results in a series of wars against the English in Ireland throughout the 16 and 1700s. This is part of the reason why the English Civil War occurs, is because, like, Charles I keeps spending money to try to put down the rebellions of the Irish. Ultimately, Cromwell really targets the Irish. As a Puritan, he sees, frankly, the Irish Catholics as agents of the Antichrist, and no, I'm not joking. He believes the Pope is the Antichrist, and therefore any Catholics are their agents, is the Pope's agents. So yeah, so Cromwell is deeply unpopular with the Irish. They rise up against him, and Cromwell spends a lot of time and money trying to put them down. Oh, let me go back. So this right here is an interesting map and kind of explains what Henry VIII is doing with his settlement policies. So this right here is a map of Ireland as of about 1300. Oh, let me go back. I didn't put it on annotate. There we go. So as of about 1300 here, you can see that the green areas, like right here, are areas where it's primarily traditional Irish population, not by Norman landlords. Now, everywhere else here, the majority population may be Irish, but the people who own the land and therefore can call for military interventions, those people are of English extraction. They're of Norman extraction, but not here. And that is a real problem for Henry. So what he does is, those areas that you see in green, those are the areas where Henry sends lots of settlers in to try and negate sort of the population of traditional Catholic Irish areas. And that should not surprise you that this is the area right here that will eventually become Northern Ireland. This is the area that Henry really focuses on to put as many English Protestants in as possible. So Northern Ireland is going to have a much higher percentage of Protestant people than the rest of Ireland. Okay, so that is really critically important to us. Now, all of this matters because there is a massive Irish rebellion in 1789. That year is not incidental. That year is also the first year of the French Revolution. That's not an accident, guys. The reason the Irish rebel is because the French are doing so also. And the Irish are like, hey, guillotines sound awesome. So England decides this shall not stand. We can't trust the Irish. Also, we don't want them getting any ideas from the French. So the British and the Irish parliaments, Irish parliament is controlled by the English, decide to enact something called the Acts of Union. And what this does is it formally creates the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Put a star by it. This is where we can start talking about the UK. Prior to this, we can talk about England and Scotland and Wales and Ireland, but we can't talk about the UK because it doesn't exist. Similarly, at the same time that they create the UK, this document also abolishes the Irish Parliament. And you might ask, why would the Irish Parliament do this? Because the Irish Parliament was run by Englishmen. That's why they do this. So they abolish the existence of the Irish Parliament, which means now Ireland is subject to the laws that are issued through the English Parliament, not through the Irish Parliament, which means they have less self-rule, and this is going to annoy them greatly. Now, England does this hoping to put down nationalist sentiment. Surprise, spoiler, it doesn't. So there is a growing nationalist movement throughout Ireland in the 19th century. Ireland continually tries to argue in favor of independence, greater rule at home, greater representation in parliament, but a growing minority and then eventually majority of people in Ireland want full independence from the English. Now, this is only made worse by the Great Irish Famine. You might know this as the potato famine, but there's actually multiple waves of it. And the major problem with the Irish famine, which lasted 4 years but had incredible effects, was in terms of something called a potato blight. It was a fungus that affected the potato crop, and most poor people in Ireland got by eating nothing but potatoes. You can imagine they were malnourished. They truly were. But this blight affected the amount of potatoes that were harvested, and it caused an incredible devastation. But here's the thing. They're right across the Irish Sea from England, which was not affected by the potato blight. And Ireland was administered by the English Parliament, and they could have relieved the famine, and they didn't. There's a video I'll link to in just a moment that you should really watch about this, which is really fascinating. So the Irish population, as a result of the Irish famine, drops from 8 million to 4.4 million people. Part of that is due to the death toll, but a larger part is due to emigration. People left, and a lot of people went to the United States, which is why, if you are of Irish extraction, chances are most of your family came over during the 1840s, 1850s, maybe a little bit later, but that's probably when they came over. Now, as a result of this Irish famine, it only intensifies the desire of people to have full independence, or at least home rule. Home rule was promised by the English Parliament in 1914. And they were promised home rule. The Irish were promised home rule, meaning that they would get a parliament back and that they would be able to govern themselves. They'd still be part of the UK, but they'd be able to govern themselves. But in 1914, World War I broke out, and the British Parliament basically said, nope, you're going to have to wait. And frankly, the Irish were tired of waiting. So in 1916, the Irish rose up against the English Parliament, and it led to the Irish War of Independence, which was a nasty conflict that lasted from 1919 to 1921. In 1921, Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, broke away and formed the Irish Free State, but not Northern Ireland, which had a stronger tie to the English traditions. because they were Protestant, and they will stay on as Northern Ireland and remain part of the UK. Now, we will come back to what this means for us in terms of modern politics later, but it's a big deal. Now, this is the video that I would like you guys to watch if you have the time. It's really good. It's about population, Malthusian crises, and famine, and it uses the case of the Irish potato famine as the example. I'm going to link you to it. I can't show it while I'm doing the screencast, but you should definitely watch it. It's very helpful. Now, so this is the proclamation of Irish independence, so there you go. Yay! Okay. Now, all of that is really important because it establishes the existence of this polity known as the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and then eventually Great Britain and Northern Ireland after 1921. But let's talk a little bit more about how the legislative system actually works. So the party system in the UK starts developing in the 17th century, primarily under Walpole, the first major prime minister. And there are two major parties, the Whigs versus the Tories. Now, you should recognize both of those parties from US history. The US basically initially just kind of stole the Whig party, and the Tories were the loyalists to the crown. Tories tended to be conservatives, Whigs tended to be more liberal. So left-right spectrum here. The Tories are your right party. My apologies. And the Whig Party is your leftist party. Not that leftist. No one's terribly leftist at this point. During the 18th into the 19th century, once we have the Industrial Revolution, we also see major changes in who gets to vote for their members of Parliament. We're voting for members of Parliament now. There is still a House of Lords. It is still pretty powerful, but you also have the House of Commons, and those are elected seats. So that means that people are getting a chance to vote in elections in the UK. But who gets to vote? So there's something called the Reform Act that is passed in 1832, and essentially what it does is it eliminates some of the property right requirements that had previously existed in the UK. The electorate was incredibly small during most of the 18th century into the 19th century, but in 1832 you double the electorate. Now it's almost entirety is fairly wealthy men. But eventually, what happens through the activities of the Chartist and other suffrage activists in the 19th century, eventually you wind up with universal male suffrage, and then eventually, following World War I, women are granted the right to vote in 1928. Now, this increasing size of the electorate means that you have more divisions in politics and more political parties form, as the demographic change of the electorate means that there are new demands to meet. So, for example, after World War II, the returning electorate has been, you've got returning soldiers who have experienced a lot of the vicissitudes of war, and frankly, having seen how the state let down veterans of World War I, they demand some sort of support from their government afterwards. This leads to more returning soldiers from World War II voting primarily for the Labour Party, and Labour Party candidates tended to be in favor of social democracy movements, that is socialism. And this develops into what is known in the UK as the welfare state. Now, we're going through this really quickly, but if you look at this chart right here, which is kind of cool, this chart shows you sort of the two major parties in British electoral politics. Really, they haven't changed all that much, although the names have. So at the beginning of sort of British political party history, we had the Whigs versus the Tories, Tories being conservatives and the Whigs being the liberals. Today we have the Labour Party versus the Conservatives. And one thing you'll notice, if you look at this chart, and let me change the color here so I don't confuse you guys. If you look right here, from basically 1945 up until right about there, right up until about 1975, 76-ish, you have very little space between the parties. That is, you certainly have one party that's in the majority and one party that's not, but generally speaking, they kind of go back and forth between who's in power and who's not, and they're never very far apart from each other in terms of how people are voting. But all of that changes when we hit 1980s, late 1970s, early 1980s, we see a split emerge. And that split is due to a woman called Maggie Thatcher. Now, this period of British electoral politics is something known as the collectivist consensus, meaning basically, even if you were part of the conservative